Hello, good to see so many of you today. My name is John Lay. I am I guess I would call it a comic book enthusiast. I have collected comics since 1973. Started when I was 9 years old. And so I've been with this a long, long time. And what I'm here to talk about today is the life and legacy of Stan Lee, who passed away this last November, I believe, at the age of, I believe it was 95, if I'm not mistaken. Well, anyhow, I know he was born in 1922 in New York. Was, as a young man, loved to read. Read the classics, a lot of the Treasure Island, the books we all read when we were kids, those fun ones. There's the fun classics and there's the boring ones. I always elevated toward the H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and that sort of thing. And I'm sure he did as well. And in his early teens, he actually won writing contests in high school. But I don't think anybody could have predicted what kind of life he would have had as far as what his legacy turned out to be. Because when he went to work for Marvel, it was actually a company called Timely. Timely Comics was founded by his relative, actually. It was, I think, his cousin or his uncle or something like that. I think it was his cousin, Martin Goodman. And Timely's whole thing was not setting trends. It was kind of following trends. They basically would take whatever was popular at the time, be it superheroes, westerns, horror, whatever, and they would turn out as much of it as they possibly could to get as much space on the newsstands as they could. And they also wanted to print as many comics as they could because basically if you had presses back then, you wanted to keep them busy. You kept them running constantly and keep putting out product. And that was how they operated. Well, back in 1939, at the age of 17, Stan Lee went to work for his uncle, his cousin, at Timely. At that time, the art director of the company, the guy who was running pretty much all of it for Goodman, was a guy named Jack Kirby and his partner, Joe Simon. And they were kind of both artists, but Kirby did more of the art, Simon did more of the business side. And basically what they did is they provided product. They made sure that they did most of the art, but they also had other people who worked with them, and they provided product for Timely to publish. And their big hit within a couple of years of Stan Lee's getting there was Captain America. Came out in 1941. That was their big cash cow. It made a lot of money for Timely. Because then, of course, it was perfect timing. World War II was just around the corner. We hadn't declared war yet. We hadn't got in it yet because Pearl Harbor was a few months away when it first came out. But it didn't take long for that to happen, and of course the sales of Captain America were huge after that. But that's getting away from the issue. Basically, at that time, he moved up in the company. He went from being like the gopher, kind of the gopher guy that went and got everything for people, like coffee and donuts and what have you. And what he ended up doing is they ended up putting him in charge as editor-in-chief because there was a dispute with Kirby and Simon. They weren't being paid enough. And they started to kind of moonlight at other companies, put a little work out here and there. And Martin Goodman found out about it, he didn't like it, and basically that was the end of them with Timely. After about 10 issues of Captain America, other people took over and they moved on to other things. They worked for DC, which is the other big competition. There's two companies that are really big, DC and Marvel. That's basically, it's one of the few businesses that's dominated by only two companies. There ain't a whole lot of them left, but that's one of them. There's a lot of little companies here and there, and they come and go, but those two have been the constants. They've been around in one form or another for basically 70-some years. So basically what happened after that, after he got made editor-in-chief, of course World War II was happening, and he got drafted, went into the military, and edited basically from afar. They would get stuff in, where he was at, and they would edit and send it back, and they would, he did a lot of that, and they had another guy in the office that did the rest. But what happened was when he got into World War II, and he got into the service, they asked what your profession is on the form. And he put writer. And when he put writer, they instantly don't want to use you in combat or something like that. They want to use you for something else. And they had these like little promotional films, promotional packets, things that were like, how not to get VD from the bad girls that you're going to be messing with, how to clean your gun, That was the kind of things he ended up working on. And he did that for pretty much the whole war. So that was, I think one of his fellow guys that worked with him was actually Theodore Geisel, who's better known as Dr. Seuss. You know, they both were in the service at the same time and both had that same writer connotation on their service record. So basically, after he got out of the military, he got married, came back to Timely. Things pretty much went on the same. It went on the same for about another 10 years. Then in the 50s, something really interesting happened. There's this psychiatrist named Frederick Wertham who wrote a book, and the book is called Seduction of the Innocent. And the theory of this book was he was a New York psychiatrist. He'd worked with kids, juvenile delinquency, that kind of thing. He had a theory that juvenile delinquency was caused by comic books. And it basically caught on. You know, you say something loud enough and with enough fanfare, it catches on. Parents got alarmed. You know, there were mass meetings. After a while, they had a Senate, did a subcommittee. Kefauver, I think his name was, Estes Kefauver was this one big politician who ran one of these. And basically, they just attacked the whole industry. And this was a huge industry back then. It's almost inconceivable how huge it was compared to what it is now. What would now be considered a bestseller wouldn't even register back then. The highest selling comic today sells like a tenth of what comics sold at that time. And there were a lot of companies. And there was a few in particular that really got hurt by all this censorship. But everybody got hurt by it. Because ultimately what ended up happening is companies went out of business, people left the industry. A lot of artists left because they were ashamed. They were ashamed to be connected with it because of all this worry, all this stuff going on. Stan Lee hung on, of course, as editor over at Marvel Timely. He was head writer, head editor. He was doing everything. But he had to be the guy that was giving people, seeing people leave and quit and be fired. I mean, at one point, he was actually literally firing the staff while Martin Goodman's getting ready to go on his vacation. He's on his way to Florida, and he's having to fire people out in the other lobby. He did what he could to get them jobs. You know, whenever he could find work for somebody, he'd get it. You know, there were times that they could, but basically what ended up happening was the comic industry, in an attempt to save itself, came up with something called the Comics Code Authority. This was a bit of self-censorship because we're going to censor ourselves before they can do it. So they did that. Unfortunately, it was a very strict code. You couldn't show authority figures in any kind of bad light. You couldn't portray cops or police officers in any kind of bad light. All authority figures were basically good guys. Everything in this code watered everything down. And by this time, the superhero comics of the 40s had kind of faded out. They disappeared because after the war, there wasn't a lot of interest in conflict. People wanted other kind of things. Started getting on to horror, westerns. But by the end of the 50s, somebody over at DC said, well, let's try superheroes again. You know, nothing else is really selling big and predominantly right now. You know, the comics code's kind of screwed everything up. So they brought back the Flash. Only they brought him back as a new character. It was Barry Allen instead of Jay Garrick, who was this character from the 40s. They brought back a new guy, a new costume, much sleeker, you know, late 50s. And that led to comics having superheroes in them again. But the problem was, as good as these characters were, and they started to come up with more of them, like they recreated a new Green Lantern. There was an old one. They came up with a second one. They came up with new characters. They came up with some new characters even. But the trouble was, because the writing was not allowed to do much in terms of, you couldn't do anything at all controversial in any ways, it kind of read like cookie cutters. They were like cookie cutter comics. You could take the dialogue in an issue of Justice League and you could move the dialogue balloons from one character to the other and it would make absolutely no difference. These guys all sounded alike. They all talked alike. They all were nice to each other. Everybody got along and everybody did what they were supposed to do. So in this climate, over at DC's having success with this, as much as they can anyway, over at Timely, Stan Lee's getting bored. He's been in the comics since 1939 now. And he's thinking, this was a place I was going to stay until I wrote a book. Now here I am 20 years later, no book, and I'm still here. So he's bored. He wants to get out. So at this particular moment, something really cool happened. Martin Goodman saw the success of DC's heroes, and he also saw success particularly of Justice League of America, which had just started, which combined all their heroes. And he says, we got to do kind of a Justice League. And he came up to Stan and he said, look, I need you to do a superhero book. You know, it's got to be whatever heroes you want to use, just get me a superhero book, a team. So Stan says, you know, he goes home, he talks to his wife, and she says, and he kind of, well, you know, I'm afraid it's going to be, you know, like we ain't going to be able to do what we want. You know, I have ideas, I don't know if they're going to like them. And his wife said to him, well, look, you're ready to quit. If you're going to quit anyway, why don't you just do what you want? Get together with your artists, pick the people you want to work with, do the book you want to do. What are they going to do, fire you? So that's what he did. He got together with one of his best artists. It turned out Jack Kirby had come back into play here. He had been working different companies during that whole censorship thing, and he ended up back at Marvel. Well, what was to be Marvel was still timely at this time. Actually, it was called Atlas at this time. They changed it to Atlas. So he got together with him and he says, I want to do this book, but let's do it different. You know, at first they said, use the old characters, you know, dig up Captain America, the Human Torch, Submariner. That was the characters Timely had in the 40s. And they said, no, we're not going to do that. No, that's not that interesting. They came up with their own characters. They came up with the Fantastic Four. And that book came out August. Well, it says on it August. It's actually November. How comics worked back then. They used to date them. I think it came out actually before that. They usually date them way ahead, like 4 months, so they can keep them on the newsstands longer. But this single comic book was the beginning of everything Marvel Comics became. Right out of this book. And it all shows when you look at it. I mean, you've got 4 superheroes. None of them have costumes at this time. They didn't get costumes till the 3rd issue. They argue among themselves. They don't get along. Human Torch is always bugging the Thing about how ugly he is. The Thing's always getting on him about whatever. Reed Richards is the most talky super genius you're ever going to run across in anything. And he constantly goes on and on and on. And finally they just go, please just simplify it. And you got the Invisible Girl, whose powers kind of fit her because she kind of just fades into the background for a while. Later on, they did give her a little more oomph. Like they gave her the ability to do force fields and stuff. But in the early books, all she does basically is turn invisible. But that's, unfortunately, comics is a fairly sexist medium. It always has been a little bit. It's gotten better over the years. They got a lot better superheroes and females now. Of course, Wonder Woman was always the exception in the old days. But that's another story that's really interesting, actually. The story behind her is a rather interesting story because that's got some real twist to it. Maybe I'll do one on that sometime. But anyhow, this was so successful, it so shook people up that Goodman went to Stan Lee and said, have you got anything else? So he says, well, you know, we'll see what we can work out. You know, he didn't really have anything thought up at the point. But him and Jack Kirby got together again, and they came up with the idea that Lee had always liked, and Lee and him both had always liked Frankenstein. But they never felt Frankenstein was a bad guy, the creature. The doctor was kind of a bad guy, but the creature itself really wasn't. It was an innocent. It really was created and rejected and lonely and miserable, and it did the things it did out of pain. So he came up with the idea, why don't we mix that together with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, somebody who transforms into that. And he came up with the Incredible Hulk. You know, it was a scientist who's exposed to gamma rays and becomes the 7-foot-tall, hulking monster that's green. Originally, he was gray, by the way. The first issue, he's gray right on the cover. And it was a color mistake, actually. They wanted him to be another color altogether. It wasn't green or gray. I think it was something like, if I remember right, I think it was almost toward purple. But they didn't get it right, so it came out gray, and they didn't like it. So the next issue, they said, well, what'll come off good on the printers? And they said green. Okay, we'll make him green from now on. That's how the Hulk got green, basically. You'd think he'd have been red, color of rage, but that's kind of, I've always been a misnomer to me. You know, he's supposed to be a rage monster, so I would have thought red would have been the obvious choice. But anyhow, it turned out to be a pretty good book. It did all right. It didn't sell as well as Fantastic Four. It got canceled after about 6 issues, but it left its mark. The character people liked the character, even though they didn't buy the book. The character was good for guest starring appearances. They started to use him in other books. You know, he turned up in their further books. He turned up in Fantastic Four in one issue, and then later on, when they added the Avengers to their line, that was their Justice League. Because at that point they had enough characters to build a Justice League, because they'd already had, because after, you know, these characters came Spider-Man, that was a big one, Iron Man, Thor. But they never put Spider-Man in the Avengers until way, way, way many years later. For some reason, they never liked the idea of that. I think they liked him as a solo character. But when they got those characters together, they were able to do that. They were able to have their big adventures like that. They also came up with the X-Men, which was a really interesting idea. This is one of Stan's best ideas, I think, because what he did was, it was the civil rights movement of the time. You know, there was a lot of civil rights unrest and a lot of things going on, and he was basically using the X-Men as a kind of way of commenting on that. You know, I think that he and Kirby kind of intended for Charles Xavier to be sort of Martin Luther King, and Magneto, the main villain, to be sort of Malcolm X. I mean, they really weren't bad guys or good guys. They were more or less guys who had a difference of opinion on how you should proceed to help your people. They had a race of people that was their own, and they had to help them some way. And Xavier believed in coexistence and peace, and Magneto was about, no, you have to have force. You know, you have to show them you can fight them and stop them, and then they'll let you alone. But it was an interesting way of doing it. And he started to branch out more. I mean, as they got more confident, it got to the point, at this point they changed the company name to Marvel. Because he liked that name. He said, we got to change the company name. Atlas sucks. It's terrible. It sounds like a plumbing place. And so Mark Goodman says, yeah, whatever you want, Stan. At this point, he had so much success, they said, yeah, whatever you want, Stan, just go ahead. So he did it. And they really started, he started to get challenges. Like somebody would say to him, come up with a comic book with the worst title and see if you can make that sell. And so he came up with a war comic. It was called Sergeant Fury and His Howling Commandos. That one sold. They challenged him. They said, come up with a character that's unlikable. So he came up with Tony Stark, an egotistical arms dealer. Yeah, this is right at the dawn of Vietnam, a guy selling arms to the military, and made him a superhero, and people loved it. It worked. And as they branched out, they got more brave. He started coming up with stuff. Him and Steve Ditko, another artist that worked with him, the guy who worked with him on Spider-Man, came up with Doctor Strange, which was a mystical character. This guy was a sorcerer and fought things from the other dimensions, and you had to see this stuff to believe it. I mean, this is like, what, 4 or 5 years before LSD gets popular, and this stuff looks like an LSD trip. Ditko would draw these other dimensions that were like islands sitting in the middle of space with no correlation to anything. People, buildings upside down, staircases going to nothing. And they had, one of his villains was a guy named Dormammu, who had a flaming head. His head's entirely aflame the entire time you're looking at him. I mean, these were fun characters. Well, there was another character named Nightmare. Nightmare was the king of nightmares. And he rode a horse. He rode this black horse and had this weird hair and was the king of all nightmares and could make all your worst nightmares come to reality. And these were fun stories. And as they stretched them more, the weird thing was he got better at it. He developed this kind of colloquial style of writing. He always kind of talked to the reader. It was not talking down or anything. It was more like he made you feel like you were part of something, part of a club. And I think he picked a little of that up from a company called EC that ran in the 50s, because they did that before they got put out of business by the whole comics code thing. They had a kind of thing like that. They called their fans fan addicts. They were very colloquial. They did a lot of funny stuff. He got that from there, but he also did his own version of it. He added his own little unique things to it. Like one day he came up with the idea, why don't we have a fan club? I mean, hey, this is big stuff. People are buying it. It's selling. Obviously, there's a market for it. Let's do a fan club. And Goodman, as usual, didn't want to spend the money, but he says, well, as long as you keep it cheap. So it was a $1 deal. You got $1. You had to pay $1. You got a poster. I think you got a certificate. You got a pad of paper which had little Marvel characters on the tops. And you were a member of the Marvel Marching Society, which is what he called it. Why he came up with that, I have no idea. But one day he got the artists together. I love this story. They're on their lunch break, and he says, hey, let's all go down to this little place that makes records. And I got this tune we worked out, and we'll just sing this song on a record and sell it to the people at the Marching Society.
Stand a little straighter, walk a little prouder, be an innovator, laugh a little louder, go forever greater, we can show you how to. And when will you be then? You belong, you belong, you belong, you belong to the Merry Marvel Marching Society. March along, march along, march along to the song of the Merry Marvel Marching Society. If you growl, if you groan, with the dour, sour outlook, if you howl, if you moan, you can lose your sauerkraut and keeping trim and in step with the vim and outstep of the Merry Marvel Marching Society.
Be an early riser,
Strive to be ambitious,
speak a little wiser,
try to be judicious,
be a good advisor,
never ever vicious.
and when
Will you be then?
But it was funny. It was cute. You know, you can look it up online. It is actually pretty funny. It's a cute little ditty, and it does catch on. It's a good ditty. It's actually not bad. But, I mean, that was the kind of things he promoted. And as the popularity grew of the company, DC started, they weren't worried. They had been around forever. They'd been #1 for 30 years. They figured they had nothing to worry about. But there were guys at DC. There were a couple of people that worked for them, long timers, that said, hey, you might want to take a look at these guys. They're doing some stuff that's awful interesting. It's going to change things. And it did. It did change the way the stories were told. It changed the way characters were approached. But at first, DC wouldn't have none of that. They just said, our comics look better. We got better art. It's more professional. Just a better product. They didn't realize that it isn't always the product. It's what's in the product that people go for. You know, maybe the Marvel comics to them look crude. They said they look crude. They had kind of crude artwork, but a lot of people thought it was fresh. They were looking at this. They weren't seeing crude. They were seeing fresh. They were seeing energy. And they had energy. God, they had energy to spare, these comics did. I mean, you could just... Jack Kirby was one of the best ever for that. His stuff just flows across the pages. It has such energy to it, such... I mean, he was known in the 1940s early on for having characters punch characters out of panel. You know, a guy would punch at a character, and it would literally go between the panel borders and hit the guy. You know, little panel borders, here's some fists going through. That was one of the things he did. They were very interesting books, and as they started to go onwards, they started to come up with more ideas. Like at one point, somebody from a handicapped organization contacted Lee and said, why aren't there any handicapped superheroes? You know, and he said, well, why aren't there? So he came up with the idea for Daredevil, who would be a blind superhero, who had a radar sense that he was exposed to radiation that blinded him and gave him super senses of taste, smell, hearing, and a kind of radar sense that he could kind of spot objects without actually seeing them. He'd know where they were. And that worked. And he said, and somebody said, well, what if people get offended? That might offend blind people. And Stan Lee said, you know what, I'll tell you what, if one person writes in a letter and says that it's offensive to them, I'll stop the book. Never happened. Never got the one letter, not one. That's kind of impressive, I think, you know, that, you know, I mean, in today's society, you know there'd be one letter would hit. The The way we are with political correctness now, oh my God, there'd be like 5 at least. But back then, he gambled and he won. So as they got more and more popular, it became a matter of not coming up with new characters so much as coming up with new ways to tell a story. Fantastic Four, you know, at this point, about 1966, they've been going about 5 years. They were near their 50th issue. And there's a legend about this. There's actually a legendary story that after number 47, Jack Kirby said to Stan Lee, well, we've put them up against everything we've had. What are they going to do now? What can we possibly put them up against? That would be a challenge. And allegedly, Stan said, how about God? Or a God of sorts. And Kirby, of course, after kind of going, you're nuts, he kind of listened to the idea, which was he came up with this character called Galactus. And Galactus basically was this being that went from place to place, planet to planet, and he lived off the elemental life energy of worlds. He had to have live, living worlds, worlds that were not dead. So he could absorb their energy. Of course, when he was done with them, they were dead. And he would absorb their energy and would continue on. But this isn't a villain. This is a force of nature. This is something that's killing things to live. And he had a herald. He had this herald, and it was a thing. The thing of it was, Lee didn't come up with that idea. He admits it. Jack Kirby did. When he was drawing the story, he thought to himself, well, if this guy's such a big muckety-muck, Galactus, he must have somebody who finds these places for him. You know, that searches them out. So he came up with the Silver Surfer. And this guy basically, and it's a crazy idea. If anyone but Lee and Kirby had done it, it probably wouldn't have worked. But it's this guy on a kind of metal, a kind of silver skinned guy on a surfboard type device who flies from planet to planet, picking these places out for Galactus. And it worked. It was a hit. This thing was so huge. This was the first, probably major continued story in comics at the time. 3 issues it ran, and it changed everything. It upped the ante, it upped the stakes. You know, it went from being, let's stop this guy from robbing a store, robbing a bank, or let's stop this guy from hurting people or whatever. It became a matter of saving the whole planet. And that was big. It became bigger. And and he had to get bigger after that. He had to come up with something a little bit bigger. And the Silver Surfer character actually became a kind of cult favorite. It was so popular, especially with people on college campuses. For some reason, it really caught on with the college crowd in the 60s, which is not too surprising because there was this noble being that really didn't want to serve Galactus. He was stuck with it because he did it to save his world. That was revealed later, that he was a being that had lived on another world Galactus had visited, and basically he worked out a bargain with Galactus, which was save me, let my world go and I will serve you. I will find worlds for you. And that's what he did. But when he turned against Galactus to help the Fantastic Four save Earth, Galactus imprisoned him here. He kept him on Earth. He couldn't leave. He could only go so far beyond, and he put up like a barrier against him. And it became a kind of philosophy kind of thing. You know, it became this thing where Stan Lee was able to tell his own personal philosophy through these stories. He was able to reflect on the problems of racism and hunger and poverty and anything he really wanted to in that time. And the Surfer was kind of this wonderful observer. He became sort of the eyes of the outsider, seeing us, you know, looking at our world and seeing it in a different way. And it was pretty brilliant, actually. It became a TV, it became a series of its own. He brought it out as a series in the late 60s. It was not a big seller. It ran 18 issues. But he said, he maintained, as far as I know, to his death, that it was a work he was proudest of. That he held it in particular esteem. In fact, when he quit writing comics altogether and became a publisher and all these other things, he kept a stipulation in his contract that if the Silver Surfer ever comes back in a series, I get first crack at writing it. He always kept that in his contract for years. He loved that character, and it was special. I have the book over there, all 18 issues. I'm lucky enough to have it signed by Stan Lee because I had the very good pleasure of meeting him once. In 2011, he was at a comic show here in Michigan. It was at the Radisson, I think it was the Radisson, in Dearborn. And he was appearing, and my wife, who was no longer with us, unfortunately, was determined I was going to get to meet him. She paid $200 for me to have a VIP ticket. But he was, and when I met him, I can honestly say he was the nicest man I ever met. He was just really nice. He was kind to everybody. He said hi to my wife, and she didn't pay nothing. You know, I mean, she paid for me, she didn't pay for her. He was nice to her. I got my picture taken with him, which is really nice. I have that on my wall. But it was a nice experience. So here they are, they're getting more popular. I mean, the 60s, 70s, they overtook DC by the 70s. They just overtook them. But a funny thing happened. DC started to adopt their methods. They started to have their characters be a little more unique and a little more, you know, feisty. They fought with each other. I mean, DC went from these Justice League heroes that barely ever said a wrong word to each other to books like Green Lantern, Green Arrow, which was, one guy was establishment and the other guy was kind of counterculture. And this is like the early 70s, and they constantly fought about what was going on in the book. You know, the one guy was like, yeah, you know, the man's going and making people miserable, and the other guy was like, oh, you can't go against the law. And they fought. You know, they didn't get along. And it was great. And it actually resulted in a very interesting book in which the both of them actually took a trip across America to see what America really was like, you know, and it became kind of like almost like Easy Rider with superhero costumes. It was very interesting. It was an interesting time. And by this time, Stan he'd been writing the comics. He'd written most of them for a long time. He finally got a guy to write with him in the late 60s named Roy Thomas. He was an English teacher. He had come to Marvel. He'd come to New York to work for DC. He got hired by DC, but he unfortunately got the worst job he could have got. He got stuck in the Superman division, which was run by a guy named, I can't remember his name. It was anyhow, he was a very mean man. He was very nasty to people. His name, Weisinger, Mort Weisinger. He was very nasty to people. And he was known for going through assistants, like paper, basically. And Roy Thomas lasted about a week. He got there and he was like, oh, I got my big job. And it was like, oh my God, I can't imagine how miserable I am. He went across the street, basically. He's talked to Stan Lee. Stan Lee had told him years ago when he wrote in, come over and take a test with us. We'll give you a shot. And he ended up being Stan's right-hand man for about 20 years. And he wrote a lot of comics. He wrote the comics that he couldn't. You know, after a while, Stan kind of softened his workload and stopped writing some of the team books after the 20 issues or so, and Roy would take him over. And he was a good, capable writer. It was a good transition. And he was a good writer. He was good in himself. He actually brought things to Marvel that other people wouldn't have. Like, for instance, he was the guy who jumped on Conan the Barbarian. That was a big book series in the 60s. And Stan didn't see it. He wasn't into sword and sorcery. He didn't get it. He said, I don't get it, but if you think it'll sell, I'll give you whatever you want. Go ahead. And he got it for a deal. It was really strange because I think he got the rights for like $50 or something. There was a real low point for Conan or something that was not selling him very high. And he told him, I take this $50, we'd buy the rights to this, we can publish this as a comic. And he did that, and that was a success too. That turned out to be a big success because it brought adult readers. More, again, here you go with adult readers. And what he basically did over a period of time, all through all this, was they were breaking down the comics code, bit by bit. You know, it was a little at a time. You know, it was a little thing here, you know, something they didn't like here, they published, and then they got away with it, and then it was something else. Little things at first. But then about 1971, they asked Stan to write an issue of Spider-Man, anti-drug issue. And this was asked by the government. This was the government division on drugs and problems with drugs. And they wanted this done. And he agreed to it. And one of the few times that Martin Goodman, when he was still publisher, backed him up. He didn't fight him at all. He said, you know what, if you want to do it, that's fine. They said they wouldn't publish it with the comics code. And so what he did, he released the 3 issues without the comics code. So if you look at that run of Spider-Man, every issue has the comics code approval on it except those 3. And the weird thing is, it's not a provocative story all that much. It's just his friend gets hooked on pills. That's all it is. His friend gets hooked on pills and ODs. And there's one scene in it where another guy, a random character, gets hooked on, is on heroin or something, tries to fly off a building, and Spider-Man rescues him. But I mean, by the standard, even by his standards, you know it wasn't. It was tame. But it was in a good spirit. But it broke down the comics code. After that, they started going, well, maybe we should do the anti-drug stories and go ahead. And then, of course, one of their big things in the comics code was you couldn't do horror. No vampires, no werewolves, none of that. Well, they broke down on that one, and Marvel published some of the first books. They did A Tomb of Dracula, Werewolf by Night. Good Lord, they did them all. Frankenstein Monster was adapted, and they did well. But by this time, Stan Lee, he'd been writing these things for a while. He'd lessened the load down to where he wasn't writing as many, but he finally said, you know what, I want to move up into publishing. I want to move up. So when Martin Goodman left, he took over. And he didn't like it. He did not like being publisher. He found out that it's meetings with guys in suits and ties and money and figures and bean counting, and it wasn't for him. He never liked it. He didn't like it at all. He got out of publishing almost within 5 or 6 years. He was gone. What he ended up doing instead was he always had this idea that Marvel could do well in movies. He had the idea that why don't we put more of the stuff in the movies? Now, he had licensed the characters for cartoons. They'd done a few cartoons. He'd licensed them in other things, of course. But there wasn't really a significant movie of a Marvel character at that time. I mean, back in the 70s, there wasn't really anything. Until The Incredible Hulk came out on TV. That was their first success. And for a long time, it was their only success because they kind of adjusted it. They made it work. They kept a lot of the element of it, which was he turned into the big green monster. But the big green monster was a guy, instead of a guy in a suit, it was a guy who was really big and they painted him green. He didn't talk like the comics. They didn't have a lot of supervillains and that kind of thing, but they used regular real life stories, and it worked in its way. And they had a great actor to sell it, which was Bill Bixby, who was a fabulous actor at the time who could sell that and made it work. They tried Spider-Man, that didn't work as a series. They tried that as a TV series, it looked very cheesy. They tried different things. There was a bad Captain America, a couple of TV movies where he has the plexiglass shield on the bike. It's horrible. The only thing that'll make you feel good about it is the 1995 version they did, where he played by Matt Salinger, where he runs away all the time. I've never seen Cap run in the opposite direction that many times in my life. It's just not right. But basically, that's what they did. They had a hard time getting into movies. And they really didn't get a break for years, but Stan kept at it. He moved to Hollywood, re-upped his family out there and said, I'm going to get us in there somehow. And he worked out lots of deals, and some of them didn't pan out. He made a deal, for instance, to get into New Line Cinema, which is run by Roger Corman. Roger Corman was this famous B-movie director. He did the Edgar Allan Poe movies with Vincent Price. Basically, he was the ultimate low-budget filmmaker because you never did a retake unless the camera fell over. There were no retakes in a Roger Corman movie. And that was who he kind of hooked up with to get Marvel into the movies. Well, unfortunately, that was not going to work, obviously. They tried to make a movie. It was called Fantastic Four. It was made in the mid-90s. It never got released. It was so bad. How bad is it? You can get it online. You can actually buy it, and it is pretty bad. I'll give you an example. Dr. Doom's costume looks good, but it's plastic. It's an armor plastic. It's plastic armor. And it looks really goofy. And the guy who plays him is very, I don't know, not right. Also, the Human Torch is generated by animation. When he flames on, it goes from a regular guy to a little torch figure. It looks like some out of an Atari game. And the best one is at the end of the movie, there's a part where Reed Richards sticks his elongated arm up through a top of a limo, waving at the crowd. It's a pool floaty with a glove on the end. I mean, Stan Lee was so embarrassed by this movie, he actually said it damaged his reputation. He literally paid money to have it suppressed. But of course, those guys in fandom, of course, somebody found a way to get it out there on DVD, but It's bootleg, but it's fun. You know, you'll actually have fun with it if you watch it. It's just terrible. If you can deal with terrible, I'll tell you what, it makes those ones from the 2000s with Jessica Alba look like masterpiece theater. You know, it's that bad. And I actually like those movies. I actually like the Silver Surfer one. I thought that was actually pretty good. That was a very nice movie. And they did the Surfer right. I thought they did that part where he goes to the building. Love that. Anyhow, that's what he spent years trying to do, is get Marvel into the movies. Happily, he succeeded finally. And the success started in a weird place. Blade. Blade the Vampire Slayer was a minor character from Tomb of Dracula in the 70s, a book that had been canceled years before. But Wesley Snipes liked the character. And they optioned it for a New Line Cinema, and this is when he was still hooked up with Roger Corman. And that was the one good thing that came out of it, was that first Blade movie, because that was a surprise hit. It got a foot in the door. It wasn't quite what they needed to really do it, though. It didn't happen until 3 years later. And that was X-Men, was the real turning point. I remember when that opened. I remember sitting around thinking, I remember thinking, just please don't let it suck. I think that was my prayer all week before it came out. As I said that, I drug my wife to it. She loved Hugh Jackman so much, she drugged me back several times because he was great in the role of Wolverine. But I remember sitting there watching that and thinking, this is what he was after. Something that would get attention, something that looked decent. And it looked good. I mean, it had room for improvement, but it looked decent in and of itself. And surprisingly, this thing made I think it was like 54 million in one weekend. And that woke up Hollywood people. That woke up the people in suits. They said, wow, there's that kind of money to be made off these superhero things? Oh, we just thought Superman and Batman were like flukes, you know? So they went back. They started to look really seriously, and a couple of things that had happened. One of them was that Spider-Man had been tied up for years because they had sold the rights to Sony or something, and for some reason, Marvel sold the rights in such a way that they couldn't get them back. They didn't have a reverse thing on it. There was tied up the rights when they wanted to make something out of it. I mean, they had James Cameron, the guy who made Avatar, wanted to make a Spider-Man movie. He couldn't do it. He did a treatment, did a bunch of stuff for it. He couldn't do a thing with it because the rights were so tore up. They went to court over and over. I mean, at least 4 or 5 times went to court. And this is in the middle of Marvel having problems, because at this point in the 90s, Marvel had their bankruptcy problems. Because after Stan left the company, some people didn't run it so good. And it almost went under. But thankfully, they got through that. But at that point, you know, they figured Spider-Man, that was the best bet. It was the biggest character, because believe it or not, Spider-Man is the biggest Marvel character. In foreign countries around the world, he has 4 times the recognition of any character in there that they've got. All of them put together, in fact. That's how big Spider-Man is. That's Superman big. And so they finally got that underway about 2001. They finally got the rights cleared out, and they got Sam Raimi to make the first Spider-Man. Who's a good choice for it? He was a good filmmaker to make it. And they made the first Spider-Man, which did really well. And again, here you go. Big business. Huge. But then a couple of years later, second X-Men came out. Then the second Spider-Man came out. And basically what you had the stage set for was what you can now call the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Because those movies were so successful, plus the Fantastic Four came out and did well. Believe it or not, as criticized as it was, Daredevil made money. It did. The only one that was a bomb, I think, was actually Elektra was the only one that really bombed. They all made money. And that's what Hollywood likes. So I hate to tell you that it's not about quality, folks, in Hollywood. It basically comes down to money. If you get the quality, that's great and that's wonderful. And they do it sometimes. And Marvel has definitely had some good luck with it. But believe me, they like the money. They like to see the money that they're going to make. And if they don't see the money, you ain't going to see the movie. But basically, by that point, they had gotten so successful that they were able to hook up with Disney, get bought out by Disney, basically, and able to make their own movies. And that is where you got to where they are today. Now you've got, all these movies over the last 10 years. It started with Iron Man and continued and continued. I mean, I can't tell you what it was like seeing the first Avengers movie. That's going to stick with me till I'm dead. That's a movie I dreamed of since I was a kid. I dreamed of something like that, but I never thought I'd live to see it. Because I always kind of gave up hope. When I was in the 70s, man, we had some really bad movies. And I figured, nah, they're never going to do it. They got lucky, though. And it did happen. And, of course, now you have this End Games coming out, and that's going to be very big, I think. I think that's going to surprise a lot of people. And Stan, all through this, he remained him. He stayed this accessible kind of guy, and he started to get popular for these cameos. These wonderful cameos he does in these movies. And it really, I think in a way, it's really weird how that part of it and the quality of the films does recall Hitchcock to me. It reminds me of the run Hitchcock had in the 50s. In the 50s and to about 1963, Hitchcock just turned out one great movie after another. I mean, it was like from Strangers on a Train until The Birds. It was just basically one great flick after another. And these are not just great flicks. I'm talking masterpieces. I'm talking Rear Window, Vertigo, Psycho is all in that period. And it was one after another. It was like he could just do no wrong. After that, he paid for it, of course. From then on, he never made another good movie. But, I'll tell you, everybody says that success is long-term, but really, when you come down to it, everybody that has great success like this, it's usually over a 10-year period. The Beatles were 10 years. 1960, whatever, to about 1969. Marvel, Stan Lee, all his creations, most of it, 1961 to about 70. It all goes in 10-year periods. Even Disney, a lot of his prime stuff was in that one 10-year period between 1937 and 1940. Just 8. Right in there. That's where, that's where that is. They may do other good things after that. They probably do. But that really creative lunge where they just one after another and it builds the company is right in that 10-year period. And that's all it is, really. And oddly enough, you've had a 10-year period here with Marvel. I hope they break the record and have another 10-year period. I hope they do, because they've done very good. I mean, there hasn't been hardly any of these movies I haven't liked, which on some level at least liked them a little, And a couple of them were real gambles, like Ant-Man, Guardians of the Galaxy. That was a gamble. My wife was so sure that was going to tank and she said that was going to suck. A talking raccoon, no. You know who her favorite characters were? Groot and the talking raccoon. She watched that movie over and over until she passed away last January. I remember she used to be always watching that movie. She loved that movie. And man, I'll never forget telling her, it could work. And her arguing with me. And she said Thor was another one she said would never make it. She said, that'll never work. And she loved Chris Hemsworth, thought he was great in the part. And she loved Loki. Oh my God, did she love Loki. He is. He's a great villain. He is, to me, the best Marvel Universe villain they've had on screen. I would say him, and the second one for me would be Magneto, which is over at the X-Men franchise and 20th Century Fox, but they've done a damn good job with him. Unfortunately, the great Marvel villain of the comics has not been adapted right yet, and that's Dr. Doom. It hasn't happened. Julian McMahon tried to give it a nice shot. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't full Doom. It wasn't full-on Doom. To me, Doom was the influence on Darth Vader. George Lucas even said so, that Darth Vader was partly based on Dr. Doom. The cloak, the mask, the breathing. It's right out of Dr. Doom, and he based it on that. And it's really kind of a shame that the original character, has never gotten quite the shrift he deserved, I felt. Anybody, by the way, before we're done here, if you want to take a look at the books, you're more than welcome to. Just wanted to say that before I forgot. Continuing on, the last year or two before Stan passed away was kind of a bad time for him. His wife passed away. They were married over 50-some years. And, I think he had some trouble with some legal matters, mostly with his who was handling his stuff, who was handling his money, and handling who saw him and who didn't. And I think it all contributed. But 95 years old, we're all going to go someday, unfortunately. But what a gift he left people. He left a gift of these characters that will live on. And him and those artists, they worked together. And he always gave credit to the artists. He had a lot of them. And there were some of them that didn't believe he could save comics. And I'll be honest with you, back when he started Marvel, if he hadn't done Marvel comics the way he had, I really believe comics would have faded out. I think the Comics Code would have strangled him. It was on the way to doing it. But I think what it was Marvel came at that right moment. He had the right idea at the right moment, and it turned everything around. And some of the artists were not believers at the time. John Romita, who drew Spider-Man for many years, when he went to work for Stan in 1965, said, I didn't plan on being there long. I knew this industry was on its way out, so I was just going to make a few bucks and move on to advertising or whatever. And he was stunned by how much fun he had. A, how much fun he had doing it, and how much he enjoyed it. And B, how long it lasted. He ended up being art director of Marvel for like 40 years. The same guy who thought it wouldn't last 10 minutes. And that's how he was. He would convince these guys. I mean, Gene Colan was another great artist. He went to work for him. He was so ashamed of being involved in comics because of the 50s stuff that he actually wouldn't use his real name, Gene Colan. He would use the name Adam Austin. And he used it for like the first 6 months he worked for Marvel, and then he dropped it. He was so proud of his work he didn't want to not sign it anymore. And I think that was the beauty of Stan, that he could get along with people. I mean, that was one of the things about him. I mean, I don't think there's a higher compliment than the fact that a writer named Harlan Ellison, who's a very famous science fiction writer who wrote comics occasionally, and is known for being very nasty to people that are nasty to him. He's very unholds barred. He had a 30-year feud with Roddenberry from Star Trek. He never forgave Roddenberry. He wrote an essay on Roddenberry that was like 40 pages long that went on about how bad Roddenberry was. But he said Stan was one of the straightest guys he ever worked for. He was a straight shooter. He never lied to him. Never messed with his work. Never told him anything that wasn't, provable or something. And that says something about you when someone like that says it. Oddly enough, he died last year too. Harlan Ellison did. Another great loss to the creative community. If you ever want to see something good, check out his old Outer Limits episodes. He did one called Soldier and one called Demon with a Glass Hand. That's quite good. Really nice work. Good writer. The one he did for Star Trek was The City on the Edge of Forever, which is considered the best episode they ever did of the original series. But, so, he made a lot of good connections with people, and he really did save the comic book industry. I don't think it would be here. I don't think the artists would have stayed with it, a lot of them. So many left in the 50s. There were some beautiful, talented people who just could not take it. They just looked at that stuff and said, no, I can't take being associated with it anymore. And the beauty of it is he drew a few of them back in. There were a few that did come back, and they did come back usually to Marvel, because he usually had the best, most open place to go. That was a place that was opening arms to people, whereas DC was kind of the old boys club. Same guys have been there forever, Usually, if they opened the door, it was usually because they liked somebody. Like they had Neil Adams, who was a wonderful artist, but he was very cinematic, very realistic. He did superheroes that looked like real people. And of course, they saw him and they jumped all over him. But he worked for Marvel too. Even he went to work over at Marvel, did freelance work in both companies, and did some very memorable work for Marvel. In fact, that's another good story about Stan Lee. He offered him any book he wanted because he really wanted to get him on his books. And he said, what's your lowest selling book? And at that time, believe it or not, as big as it is now, it was X-Men. It was on the verge of being canceled. And he said, I'll take that. And Lee asked him, why do you want to draw that? He says, because I figure nobody's going to bother me. They'll let me do what I want with it. I mean, the writer's already doing what he wants with it. I like him. We can do what we want with it, and nobody's going to give us a hard time. It's not going to be that big a deal. It can only go up, and that's what it did too. That was like 9 issues they did, or like 9 of the best issues. I mean, it's like looking at the difference between Night and Day, the one before and the one after. That first one, when you see it, you're just like, whoa. You know, it's like just looking at it on a glance, it's so much more sophisticated, stronger, better. You know, it happens that way sometimes. There was a book back in the 80s that did the same thing. It was called The New Mutants. It was very cut and dried, basic book for the first 17 issues. Then this one artist took over called Bill Sienkiewicz. And this guy was a fount of interesting stuff. I mean, he did like watercolor type art that was very dark and strange, and it was not the same book after that. To look at the book, one issue before and one issue after was like, nah, this you couldn't believe it was the same comic. But it worked. It shook it up. It brought the sales in. The sales went from like to that, you know, big bump. And they love that. I hate to say it, publishing industry is just as bad as anyone else. They like those bumps. But I also wanted to answer any questions you have or any comments. Oh, should be.
Yeah, hi, how are you?
I'm good.
Yeah, I'd just like to say I hope Marvel continues putting him in like cameos in the background, like whether it's in a constellation, a cloud, or whatever.
I think they will. You know,
hope they keep
one
doing that.
intriguing idea I heard I like actually is the idea of Ryan Reynolds as Deadpool, wearing a mustache and a stand type outfit over it, and then appearing in the movies. That's one idea I loved. I thought that actually was kind of cute. I think you will see some of that. I think you will see that happen. He'll always be a part of Marvel. I mean, that's the thing. He left us. It's one of those cases like Walt Disney. He's so much a part of the product that he'll always be a part of the product. It's always going to be one of the ingredients. You know, they could change it 4 times from Sunday from here on out, and they're still going to end up with something with Stan Lee at the end of it. It's just destiny to happen. It's destined to happen. He was a very strong personality. He was a very positive personality. That was what really struck me about him when I was growing up, was how positive he was. I remember he used to do a thing called Stanley's Soapbox, which was just him talking about stuff. And I remember he did one on racism and bigotry that was hilarious. That was just one of the things that stuck with me for years on end, how he put it in that particular soapbox. I mean, it said a lot of things I felt myself. It was put right into words. But he had a way of doing that. He had a way of having the words for people, you know? And I think that's why people liked him so much. I think that's why the cameos came off so great. It's because he had a sense of humor. They're mostly funny. A lot of them are really funny. One of my favorites is Life on the Last Ant-Man with Ant-Man and the Wasp. When the car shrinks in front of him and he says, well, too much fun in 67. I guess I'm paying now. I just thought it was just as funny. You know, like I said, it's quite a legacy to create a whole world, a whole universe of characters, to have even been part of that. And the weird thing about that, having done that, is you know somebody eventually is going to make a movie about him. There's already talk of it. Yeah, there's, Bryan Cranston wants to play him, which I'd be, if I was standing up where he's at, I'd be very, very flattered that Bryan Cranston wanted to play me. Because I think he got the praise from Anthony Hopkins for his role on Breaking Bad, the best acting performance I've ever seen in my life, I believe was the words. I don't think you can beat that. When Anthony Hopkins says that about you, you've done something with your career. I know that somebody said that the guy who plays Spider-Man should play the young Stan Lee because he looks just like him. Tom Holland, he looks exactly like him, about 20 years old. So I could see that. But I'm looking forward to that movie too, by the way, folks. I can't wait for, Spider-Man Homecoming, I believe, yeah. That's going to be good. Or Far From Home or whatever. No, it's the other one. Far From Home this time, yeah. Well, anyhow, it looks like fun. They're finally using my favorite villain from the comics, Mysterio. I always like Mysterio. Yeah, I love the concept. An old special effects guy who creates all this stuff and makes illusions that make people think he has superpowers. Can disappear in a puff of smoke and the big fishbowl head thing. And I heard they keep that, But Gyllenhaal, of course, the actor Jake Gyllenhaal had to have himself showing in a few scenes. So does what all the other Marvel actors with helmets do, which is they appear in the helmet for a few scenes and don't. You'll notice that Robert Downey does it. Thor does it. He hasn't appeared in the helmet since the first Thor, actually. Anyone that has a helmet or headpiece usually. I think the only guy that stuck with his headpiece for a long time was Loki. I think he stuck with his headpiece longer than anybody. He wore that reindeer games thing for a long, long time. They finally gave up on it in the last couple of movies. He finally said, enough of that.
He had it in Thor Ragnarok.
Yeah, he did. He had it back. I was surprised because most of them, when they get rid of it, they kind of start getting rid of it more and more. Like Robert Downey Jr. can't quite get rid of it completely because Iron Man's Iron Man, but he does as many scenes as he can where he's not wearing it. And you'll notice even Chris Evans does a lot of scenes as Cap where he's not wearing the hood part. Which is normal, that's fine. They do that in the comics too. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You want the actors to be able to emote and whatever they got to do, you know. That's good. It's a good compromise, so to speak. You know, between making it look really weird, you know. I mean, if they went the old way, they'd go spandex and everybody'd look really strange. Oh, it's unkind unless you're in perfect shape. Yeah, my days of wearing spandex are either long behind me or never were. And I think most people feel that way. Yeah. So no questions other than that. Well, I'm glad to have had y'all. Feel free to take a look around. I'll pass this over amongst you to take a look through the first issue of Fantastic Four.